Kind of move on to talk about the background of the Greek city-states, the polis or poli, as they're often called in Greek. And of course, we'll kind of get close to the classical period of Greece, classical age of Greece, which is really the most famous period they have in the history of Greece overall. I'll kind of mostly concentrate on Sparta and Athens. Those two are really the most famous of the Greek city-states that were the most powerful in the Aegean basin. So I'll kind of talk about them today. I'll kind of go back and also talk about how that period began overall. But yeah, if you have any comments, questions through the live stream, or of course also later on my channel, you can always leave comments or questions later. Also, don't forget you're a student, don't forget, of course, you can leave comments, questions, of course, in Canvas discussions. Don't forget about that, because you can get bonus points for that during the semester. Looks like Christian's also joining us this morning, so I guess I'll see some of you later also as well in the broadcast. So yeah, I want to get into today and talk about first the background of kind of where we were. I know from the last lecture I had discussed the Greek Bronze Age, the Aegean civilization, where the Minoans and the Mycenaeans flourished throughout the Aegean basin. Of course, both of those civilizations declined, as you know. And of course, I'm going to get into, and we'll talk about the the rise of the Greek city-states that emerge after that period. But one of the things that happened, of course, I was kind of getting to in that last lecture, was that they have this so-called late Bronze Age collapse that occurs where around close to 1200 BC, you get all these different civilizations like that are in the Mediterranean Sea. They collapse, like the Hittites, the Mycenaeans. They think the Minoans had already collapsed. The New Kingdom, I think, also in Egypt, declined afterwards as well. I think we talked about how it was connected to that so-called Sea Peoples invasion that came in, and that could have been maybe what the Trojan War was about. They really don't know what the Trojan War was. They're not even sure if it really happened or not. It's kind of considered like a mythological war that was fought, in the Aegean. But anyway, what happened was it brought on this kind of like this dark age throughout the Aegean basin. They often call it the so-called Greek Dark Ages, which peak between about the 11th to about the 8th centuries BC. And so it's kind of at the beginning of the Iron Age when that starts. And Greece gets invaded by these peoples that are later called the Hellenes. The Hellenes, they're called, which looks like Dorian invasion, I think, is another term they'll use for it. But the Hellenes were like the Greek-speaking peoples of the Aegean that will eventually settle there, like the Spartans and the Athenians and all those others that they have later. And I think I've got an image kind of showing kind of a slide right here. They often call it the Dorian invasion, is kind of the nickname of this period when these peoples come in and take over the Aegean region. Although, if you know about it, they were made up of different tribes that were descended from this man that they call Helen. I'll kind of show an image right here. Helen was some kind of Greek ancestor of the Greeks. They think he may have been a mythological king of some time. I think there's even claims that he was descended from Zeus from a long time ago. And he had a bunch of children, and all these children were kind of made up of what will be like Greek tribes that live throughout the Aegean. I've got kind of a slide I'll share with you right here, but he's got a bunch of sons and grandsons. He's got 3 sons, Doris, Xuthus, and Aeolus, and he's got 2 grandsons, Chaeus and Ion. So there's those names right there. And so you end up with all these different Greek tribes that follow. And I think they're usually broken down into like 3 or 4. I know the one on the far left, Doris, will be your Dorian tribes, your Dorians, basically. Xuthus had two sons, Chius and Ion. They kind of split into two different tribes, which are the so-called Achaeans. And then you got the Ionians. And then you got Aeolus, of course, the so-called Aeolians. If you want them right here on the screen, those are really four tribes, not three. And of course, from these different, Greek tribes, you get different dialects of Greek. The two most famous ones, are Doric, which like the Spartans would speak, that form of Greek dialect. And then like if you go to Athens, of course, Ionic Greek, of course, is spoken, which is also spoken like in Western Turkey too, as well. So that's kind of like the different ancestors that really made up of what will be, of course, the Greeks over time. Of course, if you think about it, the word, Hellen is kind of the term they use now for someone who's a Greek. So if you're like a woman or a man, a Hellen is a Greek person. If you're talking about the Hellens, you're talking about all the Greek peoples. And then Hellas will be, of course, the Greek word, of course, for what is Greece itself, like the Republic of Hellas. And also the term Hellenic will be used a lot too. Hellenic, pertaining to the Greeks and all their history and so on, culture. Later, the Romans, the Romans were the ones that kind of coined the term Greece. Greece. I think Grecia, is the Greek word for Greece. So they're the ones that kind of use that term later to describe, what is the Hellenes, the people of Greece. All right. Let me also go back and talk about a few other things. If you look at that slide right there, the Greeks recover over time from the Dark Age. Takes a few centuries, but they think by close to about the 8th century that the Greeks start dividing into what are called city-states, which are called a polis. Or if you want the plural, it's poli, which that's just the Greek word for what they call a city or even a state. And it's kind of like the Greek word for what would be civilization. I think the Roman word or Latin word is civitas, civilization for cities later. But the word polis, is where we get a lot of words like policy, politics, even the word police. Comes, of course, from that word over time. So all these different city-states are based, throughout, the Aegean basin, and there's hundreds of them. I forget the exact number. There may have been over 1,000, maybe 1,200 city-states that, range throughout that whole region, not just in the Aegean basin, but other areas close to Italy and close to the Black Sea, and so on. That period of Greece we'll get to a little later is going to be often referred to as the so-called Hellenic Age, or some people call it the Greek Age, I think is another nickname they also called it as well. Now, I'll kind of talk about first, I'll kind of get into it. And by the way, these are some of the different city-states we'll kind of be talking about off and on. You got Athens and Sparta. Those two really are considered, the ones that were the most famous. Sparta was the largest of the different city-states. Athens may have been one of the most populated, of course, most famous for its culture, for its democracy. Thebes, you've heard of course, whereas Boeotia, Corinth, of course, is famous. Delphi, also in Boeotia. Olympia, it's kind of in the Peloponnesus Peninsula. And then you have Argos, also in the Peloponnesus Peninsula as well. So those are examples of different city-states throughout that region. I think I've got a map. I could show kind of a map of the region of like Greece. Of course, there's kind of a map of Greece you're looking at. Right there. Let me see if I can find one. Here it is right here, kind of showing you kind of an area range of Greece right there. Of course, Athens. Athens, is the capital of the Republic of Greece, Republic of Greece, or Republic of Hellas today. You can see, of course, the modern city of Athens on the right. Athens population, I think the modern city today is like something like 3 million kind of live in there. But they do think that the average population probably of the Greek world a long time ago was closer to like something like 4 or 5 million was kind of lived throughout the Aegean basin to kind of give you an idea. That would be like around the 4th or 5th centuries BC when that was. I think I've got another image right here showing like the whole Aegean region that we're talking about in Greek, the Greek world. So yeah, you can see they had Greek city-states all throughout that whole region. So of course, Crete now there on the bottom. And there's different parts of Greece I think I've talked about before, but you see the Peloponnese or Peloponnesus on the bottom. That's basically that peninsula there. It's got a bunch of city-states throughout that region like Sparta, Olympia, Corinth, Argos. I think those are your most famous city-states. Pylos, too, I think I've got there as well. That's in there. And of course, above that is Attica Peninsula, which is where Athens is, something like 150 miles straight from Sparta would be kind of where it's located. Above that is like Thebes and Delphi, which an area sometimes called Boeotia in that area. Then you go up into Thessaly, close to where like Mount Olympus is and all that. And then you got Thrace, of course, on the northern coast of Greece, above the Aegean. In the western part, Turkey, it's got different areas also. Ephesus, Miletus, I think those are kind of famous city-states that are kind of an area called sometimes Ionia. It's kind of in the area like that northeastern coast of Turkey, I believe. It's where that is. You also got a lot of islands, of course, in the Aegean too, where there's also city-states. So a lot of islands are kind of independent city-states, including like Rhodes, Lesbos, and of course a few others. Eboa, see also as well above Attica. But yeah, those two states, Athens, the most powerful state, Sparta, of course, one of the largest cities because it controls the bottom of the Peloponnese Peninsula, and it's more known for its military. It's got a smaller population, probably compared to Athens, but both of those will, of course, dominate the Aegean world eventually. Usually they have, if you study about Greek history, they divide it into different periods. Like they have what they call the Hellenic Age, or just simply Greek Age is what it usually means, which is the peak period of the Greek city-states, which date from, they think, the ancient Olympics, which they think started in the year 776 BC, at least traditionally the date. And it goes down to the death of Alexander the Great. In 323 BC. So it's a period of like 4 or 5 centuries when the Greek city-states were at their peak of dominance. And they usually subdivide it into different periods. They have like Old Greece, or sometimes called Archaic Greece, which goes back to the Olympics, close to 776. And it usually includes like the 8th century down to like about the 6th century would be the period of it. And then you have what they call the classical Greece, which is from like 500 to close to about the 5th century, down to about the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. And the classical Greece is considered important because it's considered the peak period of the Greek city-states, not just that, but also like when Greece, like its culture was at its pinnacle. You know, it's kind of a golden age. I think also the golden age of Greece or golden age of Athens also kind of occurs around that same time period. And you get a lot of famous people that lived during that time. I kind of got a list of them I'll kind of share with you, but these are kind of famous people that lived during the classical period of Greece. Herodotus and Thucydides are probably the two most famous historians that lived during that time. Solon the Wise, of course, a famous politician of Athens. So is Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes was a famous politician of Athens. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. You probably heard of all three of those, sometimes called the big three. Those are considered probably the greatest philosophers of ancient Greece. Lycurgus, you may have heard of him, and Leonidas were famous Spartan kings of well-known. Leonidas is famous for the Battle of Thermopylae. Themistocles was a famous Athenian politician and also kind of like a general that was well known during the Greco-Persian Wars. Pericles was an Athenian politician and general who also fought during the Greco-Persian Wars. Sophocles, you've heard of him, famous Greek playwright who wrote Oedipus Rex. Pythagoras, famous mathematician of the Greeks. Hippocrates, you've heard of him. He's a famous Greek doctor. They think he's the father of medicine. Archimedes, famous Greek engineer and inventor, like the Archimedean screw or whatever they called it. Philip II, Alexander the Great, of course, famous kings of Macedonia. Of course, Alexander the Great would go on to conquer most of the known world at the time. So those are all famous, Greek city-states that are, of course, well known. One thing I'll get to today and talk about with these Greek city-states, most of them were built on high points. If you know about this, they often call it an acropolis. And acropolis was used as a area to defend the city. So it's kind of like a fortified citadel where they could evacuate to if they were attacked by other states. Of course, I'll get to it today. The most famous Acropolis is the one at Athens, the so-called Acropolis of Athens, which I'll talk about today. By the way, the word Acropolis, if you want to know in Greek, it means the top of the city or the high point of the city. And on that high point, they would build a lot of public buildings for the people, such as temples and so on. Here's you can show kind of an image of the Acropolis of Athens, which some of the buildings, they're trying to rebuild in the Republic of Greece right now, especially the Parthenon. They're trying to reconstruct it, which I'm not sure how much far they're going to go with that. But it's kind of controversial because, who knows what it really looked like before. But these are some of the public buildings that, of course, are on the Acropolis of Athens. Of course, the Parthenon, which I told you about. The Propylaea, which is kind of like a main entrance into the actual Acropolis that's there. The Rectatheon, which is a temple that they also erected, the Athenians. I think that honored mostly the goddess Athena, but also the god Poseidon. And then also the temple of Athena Nike is also a famous temple that's on the site too, near the Propylaea. And most of those buildings were built by this famous politician who lived in the 5th century BC, Pericles. He was also a Greek general as well. And I've got other images, of course, show here. Here's, of course, kind of a map of the Acropolis. The Acropolis is actually about 400-something feet above the rest of the city of Athens. Kind of overlooks it, which you saw in that short video at the beginning. But the main entrance into it is kind of on the bottom left where the Propylaea is. We walk in there. I think I've got an image showing that where I think people are kind of walking into it, for walking out of it on the right, which you see there. There's other images, of course, of it. You can see above with that right there. Now, by the way, the actual Parthenon on the bottom right, why is it all damaged? Well, in 1687, the Venetians from Venice, which is in Italy, were at war with the Ottoman Empire. I think this was part of the period of the so-called Great Turkish War. It was being fought in the late 17th century. And anyway, the Venetians bombarded the Acropolis with cannon fire from their ships. And apparently the Turks were using the Parthenon to store like gunpowder and weapons and hit it and blew it up. And so most of the roof was blown up. And so they're trying to fix it. So that's the whole reason why it looks that way. And a lot of images like real damaged, etc. But yeah, you can see other images like the Rectatheon is up there kind of to the left of the Parthenon. Supposedly there's a olive tree that's there that some Greeks claim that that was the first olive tree that the goddess Athena put there, of course, which Athena is the patron goddess, of Athens. So you got the Parthenon to the right. There used to be a kind of old Acropolis museum, you see, that's kind of to the back of the Parthenon. They've moved that, a new museum that's off site, of course. That's the one that Obama was touring, that short video. They do have some Greek temples that are kind of also connected to around the Acropolis as well. Here's other images, of course, showing, of course, the Acropolis, which is right there. But yeah, most city-states had some kind of Acropolis like this, high point where they built their city up, of course, and was used as predominantly as a fortification. Here's another image, of course, the Propylaea. Of course, here's the Temple of Athena Nike. It honors, of course, the goddess Athena, but also the goddess Nike, which Nike, also called Victoria by the Romans later, was the goddess of victory, of course. So it's kind of a little small temple there. And it's got those kind of like Ionic columns on it in that image right there. Then you got the Parthenon, which I think there may have been a temple before that, but it was destroyed by the Persians. And so the one you're looking at was the temple that was constructed by Pericles back in the late 5th century. And they think it was completed close to about maybe around 430 BC, roughly, when it was finished. And if you know about the Parthenon, it's considered to be one of the great classical architect feats of the Greeks. So it's really the greatest classical architecture of the known world, and that's why everybody wants to go look at it. But like right now, they're trying to, of course, fix it up, of course. So let's see what else. Here's, of course, another image. They do think there were 2 statues in it, by the way. There was a statue of Athena inside of it, and then there was one outside of it also as well. So predominantly it was built to honor her reign, but also it was kind of built as a war memorial to honor those soldiers that had died in the Greco-Persian wars against the Persian Empire. And I think it was used as a bank. Like if you want to put money somewhere, you could put it in a temple. Erechtheia, like I told you, was another temple they also erected around the time of Pericles, which honored, like I said, the goddess Athena, but also the god Poseidon as well. Now, they also got the Agora, which is kind of below the Acropolis at Athens. And other city-states have agoras, or also pronounce it agora, you want to say it that way as well. It's a type of centralized public square, which has like public buildings that are part of it. The term agora means either gathering place or assembly area where the citizens would all meet. It has been compared to like the Roman Forum, like at Rome and other Roman cities overall. And it was used for different functions. They would meet there, I guess, buildings for public affairs, but also like markets, probably forms of entertainment, baths, and things like that. And they have also temples there too. And so all that's kind of equated to like kind of like the Roman Forum, in a sense, kind of a similarity to it. I think I've got another image showing like one at Ephesus as well, where they have kind of a agora there as well. So it's kind of like a public square where most of the citizens, of course, could do different things within the city-state. Now, also about the Greeks, they had different forms of government that they kind of experimented with. At least 4 different types of governments were popular. Of course, the ones that they always talk about the most is democracy and, of course, the so-called oligarchy. Those 2 were really the 2 most popular forms of government in the ancient Greek world. I'll kind of share with you a little bit about all those different types. Traditionally, the one that was the oldest was the monarchy. You can see it went back to like something like before 800 BC, where they were ruled by kings. And of course, it was inherited power passed down, hereditary, to their children, like their sons, could be a queen also. So yeah, that's traditionally. I think the only state that kind of has that later a lot is Sparta. Sparta has, traditionally two kings later, but they have kind of like an oligarchy, as you'll see later. And oligarchies were popular too, especially going back like 8 to about the 7th centuries when they were popular the most. And that was a type of government where they were ruled by a few people, which will be mostly like wealthy nobility, like the upper class controlling everything. And the best example of that was Sparta. Sparta had, the best example of an oligarchy. They tried to spread their ideas of government to people overall. You also have what they call a tyranny as well, tyrants. Tyrannies were like a rule by a tyrant, which that's where a nobleman, like an aristocrat, would seize power, and he had like absolute power over the state. Usually they would sometimes cancel like the Constitution if they had one, suspend some laws, and tyrants were equivalent to like a dictator later. I think the Roman dictator we see later is kind of equivalent to it. And then the democracy, that's the one thing that's more famous than anything. Democracy, of course, meaning ruled by the people. And of course, from the Greek word demokratia, was an Athenian-style government where all the male citizens took turns in ruling the state or running for office or voting. And so that's something that's unique, about Athens. That particular form of government was the most influential in the world overall, not just in Europe, but the rest of the world in general, especially in the West. And so a lot of governments, of course, were heavily influenced by that, of course, today. So yeah, it's something they're kind of famous for, democracy throughout the world. However, you see there, male citizens, women didn't really have any political rights or anything like that. So you don't really see that closer to even like modern times, believe it or not. Now, of course, the other thing, of course, we'll talk about too is military as well. A lot of city-states relied on a national defense where they had these citizen armies that fought for their state, of course, called militias that they have. And Greeks had infantry foot soldiers were pretty much the main people that were part of their traditional armies, Iron Age armies, which were called a hoplite, so-called hoplites, which you see in that image right there. And hoplites were heavily armed soldiers that used spears in formation, usually with overlapping shields. And I'll get to it later. They use what they call a phalanx formation to, of course, fight in. And hoplites, most traditional states had some kind of form of a militia that they had. Most of them were citizen armies, but there were a few that had professional armies, like Sparta, probably be the best example of having a professional army. So did also Macedonia. They would, of course, had one of the best later that'll conquer all of Greece. But most hoplites, especially like Athens and other states, had some kind of occupation. Most of them came from the middle class. In fact, a lot of them were farmers, or they were artisans of some type, where they had some kind of skill. They had, like, I don't know if you know about Socrates, was a philosopher, but he was also a stonemason, and his father was a stonemason also as well. So they would train on the side militarily, and then they had a real job they had. It's almost kind of like the National Guard or something like that. Be kind of what was kind of equivalent to in a sense. Here, of course, you can see this image right here, but the phalanx, the so-called Greek phalanx, that was the main battle formation that Greeks used in, of course, the Greek world. It's used down like the time of Alexander the Great and afterwards. even fighting against the Romans later proved to be not as good as the Roman legion. But the term phalanx is a Greek word meaning battle line. That's what it means. And it's a rectangular battle formation where you have these hoplite infantry foot soldiers fighting close formation using spears and overlapping shields. And how a phalanx usually worked was that the soldiers that are in the back would push the men forward and literally drive the other formation that they're fighting against off the field of battle and destroy it. And so the shields were kind of important because they protecting not just themselves, but the guy next to them also as well. And when they, broke formation, they would then use also swords in battle. Got different images, of course, showing, I guess, kind of reenactors, I guess, that are kind of like one on the left is hoplite. Then you got some Roman legionnaires as an example right there. But you can see some of the equipment that a lot of these hoplites had to wear, like armor, and of course the weapons that went with it. Traditionally, a lot of these, like I said, came from the middle class. And so a lot of them had to buy their own weapons, their own armor. So the state didn't really give it to them, if you know about that. And kind of show other images, which is right here. They had different kinds of weapons they used, by the way. The ziphos that you see right there on the right and on the left. The ziphos, of course, traditionally was the type of sword that they use, which ziphos is just Greek for sword. It's what it means. And there were two types of Greek swords. They had the traditional straight sword, which you see on the bottom or at the left. And then you had also what they call the kopis, kopis, K-O-P-I-S, which was kind of like what they call a curved sword. So I think that was kind of a popular sword. I think the one on the top right may have been the one that the Spartans used a lot in battle. I think they had longer swords too. If you're a cavalryman, like a knight, they had a longer sword. Of course, they also had, if you go back to it too, I didn't show you this real quick, but the actual primary weapon that they used in a phalanx is called a dory, which is just Greek for spear. And hoplite spear was traditionally 8 to 10 feet, I guess would be kind of the range it could be on average. Usually had a wooden shaft that was maybe about 2 inches in diameter, which probably weighed about 3 to 4 pounds at the most. That's how heavy hoplite spear was. It's made of different types of wood. The actual shaft, which either from the ash tree or cornel tree, and you see there that reenactor, hoplite spears were basically thrusted overhand, like at the enemy in front of you. And so the first few rows might be trying to stab guys in front of them that are in front of their formation. And then, like, if you break formation, you would then pull your sword out, which a lot of times was kept behind the actual shield itself. They had different kinds. I'll kind of maybe get to it later. But Macedonia, they had what they call a sarissa, which is like a pike, which a pike is like a long spear, which they vary in length. Like, I don't know, 15 to 20 feet probably was the average. 18 feet might be a good average, 18-foot spear. And those were used to repel not just other infantry that might try to attack them, lunge at them, but cavalry as well, to stop cavalry charging at infantry. And something that Macedonia developed under the kings like Philip II and also Alexander the Great. They use those a lot, especially in the center of their armies. And those are heavy spears. I think I've got some images later of it. I think they weigh up to something like 12 to 14 pound range. Of course, they also had different kinds of armor. Traditionally, the Corinthian style helmet was the one that's the most famous that they used. These were bronze helmets that were used by Greek and also Roman armies as well, the Greco-Roman world. That's the one traditionally you'll see people wearing. A lot of different hoplite soldiers. Yeah, here's other images right here showing the so-called Corinthian style helmet that was very popular in the Greek world. Didn't really have any ear holes, by the way, on the side, so that was kind of made it difficult. It almost became more like a hat you wore that you kind of pulled over your head. Of course, they had different kinds of armor. On the left, you have what they call a cuirass, which cuirass is like a type of body armor that kind of wraps around you. I think they call it torso armor is what they dub it. And then on the right, they had also what they call linothorax, which is a type of linen armor they had that was kind of popular. And then sometimes they have layered armor too as well. I think they call it sometimes lamellar also, but there are different types of armor that were worn. The cuirass, which you see on the left, was more heavier. Also, they had different kinds of shields. Also, the hoplon was the so-called round shield. It's actually where the word hoplite originated from, because the carrier of these shields in battle. And traditional hoplons were made of oak wood, about 2 inches thick, like it says. And they would usually put a bronze skin on the outside of it to make it toughen up. And they would also put images on the outside of it, which might represent, the actual city-state that they're fighting for. So hoplons, the Greeks, traditionally preferred a round shield. You'll see later, like other states, like the Romans, prefer more of a rectangular square shield. They also have other kinds of armor, like they have what they call greaves, also, which you see on the left and on the right. Greaves are just basically what they call leg armor, which that could be made of different things, also like bronze, leather, even cloth also. So those would be kind of used to protect your shin, your legs. Didn't have much protection for your feet, though. That's the only thing. Wore like just a traditional sandal, like the Romans. Sometimes they would take their dories and stab you in the foot, or try to stab you in your genitals, or something like that. Kind of a bad thing, I guess they would try to do to people. But you can see a traditional hoplite soldier up there with the hoplon. And he's got the linen tunic or linothorax. They got armor, and the guy on the right looks like he's got the cuirass torso armor instead. But most dories, the spears, had two tips to it, which one might be the main primary tip, and you obviously had a second tip if one of them broke off. Yeah, here's kind of a phalanx formation using a long spear. We call it pike. So traditionally they have those later. It varied on phalanx sizes. It was all dependent on basically the depth of it. So, it depends on how deep the rank was. Like an 8-rank phalanx had a lot more men in it compared to a 16-rank one. So, and I think there's even cases where some of the Macedonian ones were like 32 rank. So it was like massive formations. But most of those formations later proved to be not as good as the Roman legions that eventually fight against the Greeks. They get beat later by that. Now, let me go on. I want to also talk about the rivalry of Athens and Sparta. So both these, states had their own armies traditionally, but they were kind of different from each other culturally. If you know about Athens and Sparta, Athens was more known for its culture. That's the one thing about it. A lot of arts, democracy, philosophy, history, those kind of things. And then Sparta traditionally was known for its military, very little culture in general. In fact, the Athenians thought the Spartans were kind of almost barbaric in a sense, uncouth, compared to them. Thought the Athenians were more civilized, that kind of thing. So I'll kind of go through today and talk about the differences between these two different city states. Let me go ahead and, of course, show you kind of another image of the Greek world again. Of course, so you can see Sparta, so on the bottom of Greece, that area, the so-called Peloponnesus. You've got they call it different names, Peloponnese or Peloponnesus. That's the so-called bottom peninsula of Greece. Looks like a four-fingered hand, kind of the way it looks right there. And Sparta is a Dorian state that mostly dominates the bottom of it. Especially the area of where Laconia is today. And there's another area kind of the west, I'll get to it, which is called Messenia. So both those areas are kind of controlled by them. And then you can see Athens is kind of to the northeast of Sparta. And I think it's like 150 miles straight. Like if you go by, I guess, like a plane flying straight to it, it's about that far from, almost dead east of it. And so you can see the different locations. In Athens, located on a peninsula called Attica, is what they call that area. Of course, here's kind of another map showing you the different peninsulas, throughout the region. So yeah, Attica, right there where Athens is. They got right below that the Isthmus of Corinth, it's called, that kind of connects it as well. And then you got the Peloponnese or Peloponnesus, which of course is below it, right there. But yeah, a little bit about Sparta. Like I said, Sparta kind of goes back to the Greek Dark Ages. They think that's when the actual traditional Spartan state we know really started in the Greek age. You have the Mycenaean Sparta. They had a long time ago, like Menelaus that we talked about, like so-called Trojan War. That's if he existed. We're not really sure if he was a real king or not. What we know is that sometime during the at the end of the Greek Dark Age, they think the Spartan state probably began to develop. I want to say 10th, 9th century is they think the time period of when that state really got started. A little bit about their names. That's one thing about Sparta. It goes by different names. Sparta is like the name of the city, more or less, where the state is based around. It does have another name that they call it traditionally, which is Lacedaemon, which Lacedaemon was what they call the Spartan homeland or Spartan country, like where the city of Sparta was, just kind of like its capital. And it's believed the name is derived from a mythological king of Greece who lived in that area named Lacedaemon. They believe he was a son of Zeus in origin. And traditionally knows, if you know about this, he had a wife who was his queen, whose name was Sparta. And so hence the name of the city, of course, the Spartans kind of comes from later over time. Now, I guess you can see there's some of the things I'll kind of get to it later about the Spartans, but they'll eventually take over that whole region of the southern part of the Peloponnese. Let me go back to it right here, but they have like this you can see that area which is on the bottom there. Those are the areas where Sparta will kind of dominate. So Laconia is the centralized area of about where the city-state is roughly, but they also control that area to the west that's called Messenia as well. I think I've got a better map showing it right here. So you can see Sparta is located right there. Which, by the way, Laconia is spelled different ways. You'll see it spelled with a C, and then sometimes you'll see it with a K, like traditionally with a C usually. It's just the Greek transliteration of it. But that whole area the Spartans will kind of subjugate Messenia, which you see there. And I'll get to the so-called Helots later. Helots, which I think were mostly in Messenia, in that area, will be kind of like become like slaves of the Spartans over time. Before I get to that, I did want to talk about Lycurgus. He's kind of an important figure in Spartan history, going back to either the 9th or the 8th centuries. It's kind of a debate about when he lived. He's kind of considered like a mythological king of Sparta, kind of like Menelaus. And they believe he's considered important because they think Lycurgus was the one that helped found the traditional Spartan state that'll exist during the Greek age. And he developed a lot of their traditions, like their military traditions. He developed a lot of their laws, their courts. I think there was even a case where I think later some of the Greeks called the laws of Lycurgus, it was called the Code of Lycurgus or something like that. And he's kind of comparable to Solon the Wise, who was a famous politician, of course, of Athens. I think those two kind of become comparable to each other. I think I've got other images here, but here's kind of like a pyramid scheme of like what Spartan society traditionally looked like. I'll get to it later, but Sparta's an oligarchy, that type of government. But traditionally, most of the citizens that dominated are your Spartan nobility, which is pretty much your primary upper class. And then you have what they call the paroikoi, which is kind of like these free non-citizens that live in the Spartan territories. A lot of them are kind of like a middle class. I think a lot of them are like artisans and merchants that run a lot of the businesses throughout the Spartan state. And they do have some political rights, but not equal to, of course, the Spartans. And I think that map showed you, we go back up to what I was showing right here. Some of those cities that are, I think, in blue were cities where these middle-class people had some power, and included some foreigners that would come to the city-state. But they didn't have the same equal power or equal rights as citizens that might come to Athens and live there overall. Going back to that, of course, social pyramid of Sparta. Of course, on the bottom was the so-called Helots. And the Helots were considered a type of people of that region that were basically considered slaves, the agricultural slaves, though it's been debated about whether they were slaves or like a serf. I think it's been kind of compared with each other, but it's believed that Helots made up a majority of the population of the Spartan state. I think Herodotus claimed that they outnumbered them like 7-1. And Helot rebellions were quite common, where they would rebel against the Spartans. And supposedly that's why the Spartans became such a military society, because they always had to be on alert in case they rebelled against them. And quite often, I think you could read about in history how the Spartans would sometimes even kill Helots. They got too many of them. And I think a right of a Spartan soldier when he's training, when he's young, you're supposed to sneak out your barrack and kill a Helot, without being caught. But anyway, of course, one thing that they talk about too that supposedly King Lycurgus created was the so-called Aegean. Which, if you know about the Aegean was like the Spartan military school where they trained Spartan soldiers from young boys, which supposedly the word agag or agaga, maybe in Latin, means to raise or to rear. And so, about Spartans, when they were infants, they would actually basically take a baby, and if it's got some kind of defect or they don't think it's going to grow up to be big and strong, they'll actually leave them to die. So they don't want any weak or anything like that. And then at the age of 7, boys are taken from their parents. They're put into these schools. And reading and writing not considered important. Yeah, it's true about that. And so they do a lot of, fitness testing, military style training. It's like Marines starting from the age of 7, I guess, instead. But from 7 to like, I think 29 or whatever, you actually have to live within barracks with other men, in this training. So I think it's like from the 7 to 20, I think is the main years where they go through military training, where they live in barracks. And a lot of the main soldiers that are in the Spartan army and a lot of their main leaders are kind of chosen during that time. To lead the Spartan armies, of course, later. But yeah, they actually can't live with their wife until like they turn about 30, believe it or not. And a lot of them are in the military until they're like 60 years old. That's a long time, unless they get killed. Of course, girls had more rights than other Greek women, which is true about that. They had some military training they went through, but a lot of the training of women was more geared towards really educating them and I guess prepping them for marriage, raising families and things like that. But they had more rights than most, Greek women throughout the Greek world, etc. And quite often they had to marry more often because a lot of husbands either were gone from war, they got killed. And so oftentimes there were more women than men in Spartan society. Spartan society, by the way, was very egalitarian. That's something that's true about it. They all kind of dressed the same, wore similar kind of, style uniforms. And they didn't do a whole lot of manual work or anything like that. They were traditional soldiers. And the helots, were used to do all the work, like especially agricultural work, farming, etc. They weren't very materialistic either, the Spartans. Very little culture. I think they used iron as money instead of like gold, silver, or whatever people used money for back in those days. Like I said, the Spartans had little culture compared to, say, the Athenians, of course. Then you have the Spartan government, which I told you the Spartans had an oligarchy, which they had. Usually when a Spartan soldier turned 30, you could participate with the actual government, like with its assembly, various councils, even be elected as a magistrate to the state. And if you study about the Spartan government, traditionally it was an oligarchy where they had 2 kings. One king was used to run the army, you see, and they had another king was in charge of matters at home, like domestic stuff. And then you see they had what they call a council of elders, which I've got the name for it if you want. The council of elders was called a Gerousia, and it had 30 men on it, 28 citizens that were over 60 that had already been in the military that were retired. And then you had 2 kings on it. The 2 kings were on it too, as well. And the council of elders acted as kind of like a court too, like an actual court, as judges of law and things like that. And I guess they helped to advise the kings. And then you had also the Apella. The Apella was the Spartan assembly, where you could approve various laws and things like that overall. So that's how kind of the Spartan government was broken down. It's almost a cross between a monarchy and a democracy in a sense, but only a democracy among predominantly the Spartans, that male Spartans that could participate openly in it. They also had these men that were in the government that are called ephors. You may have heard of them. They had 5 of them. And these were magistrates that were elected annually, I think for 1-year terms. That also helped to advise the kings. In a sense, they were kind of almost like de facto rulers that ran the state along with the actual kings. So traditionally, yeah, the Spartan government was that's what they had. They had an oligarchy, which was kind of at loggerheads with the Athenians' democracy. Athens didn't really like that form of government that they had, and that's part of what led to the different animosity between them, not just because of their different cultures. Sparta had an army, and Athens had more of a naval power in comparison. Now, let me also get to and talk for a few minutes on the Athenians as well. Athens was an Ionian state. I told you that went back to the Greek Dark Ages when it kind of emerges as an important state. Like I said, it's located on the Attica Peninsula, kind of north or east of Sparta. It's about where it's located. It's more known for its cultural influences, like I told you, democracy, arts and science. I told you about history. We talked about all those kind of different things that the Greeks are kind of known for traditionally, but they're also known for their maritime power. I'll get to it later, but the Athenian Navy is pretty important for a long time, especially around the time of the Greco-Persian Wars. It's part of why they win that conflict is because of naval power in general. And I've talked about it before, but of course, the namesake you see of Athens is the goddess Athena. Athena, of course, one of the daughters of Zeus. She's often associated with like wisdom, war, and the olive tree overall. We'll talk about Athena later and a lot of the different gods, of course, in Greek mythology that are famous. Here's kind of course, another image showing you, of course, the Greek world where Athens is. Of course, Athens, the most populated city, of course, in the Republic of Greece. I think the population of Athens, though, in Attica may have been like 50,000 people at the time or more, which would be like around 5th, 4th century BC. And it's an area that includes like that area of Attica I told you about, where Athens is, of course, today. Yeah, we'll get to Athenian naval power. That is something that they're very famous for. Of course, the Greeks were known for the famous warship called the trireme, which is a type of Greek warship that was powered by oars and, of course, use of sails. As you see, that was considered one of the greatest warships at the time when it was built. But let me get into more like politics more than anything about Athens. Like I said, Athens is famous for its democracy. I mean, one of the men that first helps to really get that started is Solon the Wise, as they call him. He's considered to be the father of Athenian democracy. He's really one of the first who really starts, to make, reforms to the Athenian state at that time. And prior to him, Athens, the kind of politicians that they had that ran the state were actually tyrants that they had. And they had this one tyrant here I'll kind of share with you. His name was Draco. He lived in the 7th century BC, and he was known for developing what they call draconian laws, which were very strict against the people. Capital punishment for all kinds of different things, not just murder, but theft and so on. And so Solon was one of the first to come along and cancel a lot of these kind of laws out, and he created more democratic laws. I think the only form of capital punishment you could get was really murder. Was about it. What were some things that he did, Solon, to reform the state? He actually changed their whole economy. One thing that Solon did was he got Athens to specialize in growing olive trees to make olive oil. And so Athens became known for exporting olive oil. That's one of their basic economies that they have. They think it's part of one of the things that will evolve over time to help create the Athenian Empire, exporting different goods to different parts of the Aegean basin. He also canceled all debts in the form of serfdom and child slavery. Was another thing he did, because a lot of people would get in debt, and one thing they would do is they would sell their children to get out of debt or something like that, or go into serfdom, and he banned that basically. The big thing Solon did too was he created Athens into different social classes. It was kind of unique about it, which they had kind of like four social classes they had. And traditionally, they had an upper class, which was comprised of the aristocracy, and then those that were in the cavalry, in the Greek militaries would be part of that, or we call it knight. Then the middle class was like the hoplite soldiers, which a lot of them were mostly peasant farmers traditionally. And then your thets are like your lower class. These are like landless peasants, would be basically the ones on the bottom. They traditionally at that time didn't have a whole lot of political rights though in Athens. And most of the power was really in the hands of the upper and middle classes. Let's see, a few other things too. He is also known for creating a lot of their laws and their constitution. That's kind of important there as well. So he's kind of considered Athens' great lawgiver. Is I think one of the nicknames they sometimes call him. They create a lot of their laws, a lot of their assemblies, a lot of their traditional courts were also developed by him, which I'll get to it, of course, today a little bit, but a traditional, like a Greek consul was often called a bulle. Bulle was a type of council of male citizens that ran the affairs of a state. And so that was, they think traditionally, one thing that Solon did was he created one of these main assemblies to run the affairs of the state, which I think they call it sometimes the Council of 400, I think is kind of a modern name that they called it, where 400 representatives would be elected by law, usually annually, to help run the state. They had another assembly called the Ecclesia, and then that assembly, I think all the male citizens could participate if they wanted to. He also had this other thing he developed too that's famous called the Areopagus, which means in Greek, hill of Ares or rock of Ares. And it was a type of Athenian high court of appeal, kind of like a Supreme Court of some type, where they would appeal cases. They dealt with also capital punishment issues. And it's kind of been compared sometimes to like the United States Supreme Court or other kinds of Supreme Courts that are kind of out there. And it was called the Areopagus because they met near the Acropolis on this part of it called the Rock of Ares or the Hill of Ares. And so it got its name from that over time. So, yeah, he's known for a lot of different things. Solon the Wise, he was kind of considered almost like a philosopher as well. Now, the only thing was, though, they had other, kind of get to it, too. They had other politicians that were in Athens as well. Pisistratus was another I'll kind of talk about, and I'll talk about Cleisthenes as well. They think around 560, tyrants took over the state. Is one thing that happened. Pisistratus had these two sons named Hipparchus and Hippias, and so for about 50 years, they think from about 560 to about 510 BC, Athens was controlled by these aristocratic tyrants, which were kind of like dictators. And actually, they were popular with the lower classes, like the Thets, kind of liked them because they kind of gave them more power. And so for about 50 years, they controlled the state. They kind of suspended some of the laws that Solon had kind of created during that time. So they kind of wavered back and forth between having a democracy and having a tyranny. But over time, what happened was they were kicked out with help from Sparta. Sparta at the time was actually kind of allied with Athens around that period. They helped drive out the tyrants that were controlling Athens. And so in 510 BC, this man named Cleisthenes seized power in what was like basically like a political revolution, sometimes dubbed the so-called Athenian Revolution. And however, the Spartans had wanted them to create an oligarchy. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to put back in democracy. And so Cleisthenes would go on to restore democracy to Athens. And so Cleisthenes is traditionally known as the father of Athenian democracy also as well, in a lot of his things that he did. Those are some things that he did that are kind of famous. He's known for creating the so-called Council of 500 or Bulle of 500, which they think the Council of 500 is considered to be one of the first major democratic assemblies in history because of the way the actual representation was broken up. And what he did was he broke up all of Athens, I guess Attica, into basically 10, what they call 10 demi, or 10 tribes, I guess. And each tribe could send 50 members to this council, equal to 500. He also gave them term limits. So looks like they were limited to like 2 annual terms, basically, is what they could do. And they are all elected by lot, of course, is how they were chosen to be elected to this council. Also, another thing he's famous for, besides the Council of 500, he also established what they call ostracism. And every so many years, I guess every year, I think, usually annually, I think is what it was, they would choose to kick somebody out that they don't want to be, I guess, in their tribes. And they'd ostracize them. And if you get the most votes, you had to leave for like 10 years and you couldn't come back. I think that's what happened to Socrates. He was ostracized, but he chose death instead, is what occurred. So that's kind of Cleisthenes, of course, who he's famous for, traditionally, what we call democracy and all that. So I'm going to get to it later. We'll talk about this man too. I didn't really get into it, but I'll talk about the age of Pericles also. Pericles is a famous politician that emerges in the 5th century BC. He's probably considered the greatest politician that they have. He was also a general during the Greco-Persian Wars. He's kind of living during that time. We'll talk about him. He's the one that rebuilds the Acropolis behind me. And is famous for constructing the Parthenon today. We'll talk about that. I'll get into the Greco-Persian Wars next week too, which is a major event in Greek history. We'll talk about that too also as well. But before I go, I did want to remind you, don't forget you got that bonus quiz on the Great Wall of China that's still out. So that's something y'all need to, of course, try to wrap up on and get out the way. And then don't forget you got that a second vocabulary due starting on Friday. I'll probably give you into next week to turn it in, but that's something y'all need to start uploading this week, of course, and this weekend coming up overall. But all these lectures I'm kind of working on right now, they're going to, of course, be geared more towards, of course, some second exam I'm going to have later, probably maybe at the end of March, I'll probably have it, of course, in the semester. By the way, I had some other students, I think, that came in late. Looks like Tristan, hey, what's going on? I think y'all came in late. Looks like Becky had joined us also earlier, along with Alex. And then also looks like Kelsey was also joining us as well. And, of course, also Samantha, too, also. So hope everybody's having a great morning and, of course, week of classes at BRCC. So that's it. Doesn't look like there's any comments, questions, historical comments, but you can leave comments, questions, of course, on my YouTube channel. Or don't forget, students, you can also leave comments, questions in Canvas discussions as well. So that's it for the week lecture-wise. Of course, next week, like I said, I'll continue talking about Greek history. I think mostly we'll get into the Greco-Persian Wars, but I'll also talk about what we call Greek culture as well. So y'all take care and have a good weekend coming up as well.